I never completely loved the original Focal Utopias, but I definitely respected them. And so when the opportunity came up for me to get my hands on a pair of the 2022 version, I thought it was worth giving it a go to see if Focal had fixed some of the things that just held me back from really loving the originals. If you're not familiar with where the Utopias sit in the scheme of things, these are a $5,000 headphone, making them absolutely one of those peak, pinnacle, aspirational type flagship headphones. And theoretically, what you're getting for your money with a set of the Utopia 2022 is some of the best engineering and the best research and science that Focal has to offer.
Been weaker, it's been waiting for the right day. Like the right day ever comes, now it's Friday. And nothing's changed. Mistakes that everyone is making, but I can't change. I'm stuck in reverse like an old Benz. Forgot to tap it up. Now I long for another day where things fall into place. So if you're down, I'll be down. Pack your bags, fill them up. We can go tonight, take a flight to a higher ground. How does that sound?
Before we dive in and take a look at the headphone in detail and talk about its specs and its features, let me quickly just cover off what you get alongside a Utopia 2022 if you go and buy a pair. And that's to say that you're going to get this hard carry case here. So if you do need to move these around or you just want to keep them safe from dust, you can pop them in this case. That's a nice inclusion. It's a proper hard case. I really appreciate that. There's also some nice cable management included to keep things safe in there. And then speaking of cable management, you also get two different cables. You get this 3.5mm with an adapter to 6.3mm cable, as well as a larger, longer XLR-based cable. In both cases, the cables are what I'd call nice enough. They're not particularly special or luxury to interact with, but they're far better than some of the cables, even with some of the other flagships, and perfectly serviceable for most situations. And that's kind of lucky because one of the things that the Utopias do that the other Focal headphones don't is they use these connectors here. These are what's called a LEMO connector, and they're used in a number of different locations, but not so often in headphones. And what that means is they're not a particularly common cable to have just lying around. It's not like you'll have had other headphones where you might have picked up an aftermarket cable and so you can just swap the cable between that headphone and the Utopias. Instead, what it means is that if you're buying yourself Utopias and you don't like the stock cable, you're going to have to go and buy a bespoke cable for the Utopias that's probably only going to work for the Utopias. And so in some ways, that's a little bit of a drawback. But on the other hand, it is a connector that I really like. It's sturdy, it's secure, it's high quality. Admittedly, so can a 3.5mm be. But other than the fact that it's not a generic, kind of widely used connector, I really like the LEMOs. And so that's probably a nice segue into a tour of the headphones. And that's to say that you've got the LEMO cable entry on the bottom of each cup. While we're talking about the cups, much of the cup is actually made of plastic with elements of metal where it makes sense to have them, either for the accents or for structural stability, like the grill, for instance, is metal. And the fact that it's a plastic cup really shouldn't be a problem. There's high quality plastics and there's cheap quality plastics. And the good news is, as you'd expect for your $5,000, that the plastics within the Utopia 2022 are all high quality. I think they're actually a nicer finish the way they've chosen to do it than the originals. That's just personal taste. And then speaking of that, we've also got this beautiful colorway where everything's pretty much black with just a hint of red inside the back of the speaker grill. As we move up from the cups, and then we'll come back down and talk about the drivers in a moment, but moving up from the cups, we've then got this headband here, and this is actually made out of recycled carbon or carbon fiber that's then been forged into a single piece. And I really like that on two levels. Firstly, I think it looks really interesting. It does look a little bit like camo. I thought they were going for a black camo at first. That's not what it's meant to be. But the other reason I like it is it means we're probably actually making use of waste products, and that's going to be better for the planet. On a side note, it probably makes it cheaper for Focal because they're going to be using scrap carbon fiber and recycled carbon fiber. But so long as the end result for us is a high quality product, I don't really mind if they can save money there and apply it elsewhere into R&D or reduce costs in the long run. That's fantastic. We'll wait and see. I don't want this to turn into a price thing and a price of production thing. For me, it's all about whether the product looks and feels high quality and whether it performs to the level that you expect it to. And certainly these yokes absolutely do. They feel great and they look great. As we follow those yokes up, we then get a nice padded headband. These are a very comfortable headband. I think they're as good, maybe even better than what I experienced on the older models like the Focal Clear OG, etc. I certainly have had no issues with any kind of hotspot or discomfort on the top of my head, even when wearing these for long periods. And so far, everything's stacking up really, really well. If we now come down to the ear cups themselves, we've got these lovely leather pads here. They're perforated leather for most of the pad. And then deep on the inside, there's just a change of material close to the actual driver itself. And that's going to be there for a combination of the airflow within the housing or within the space around the driver when it seals to the ear, as well as potentially breathability for your ears, and also potentially the diffraction of any reflected audio within that space. There's going to be a rhyme and reason to that. I haven't dug too deep into it, but it's nice to see that the pads on here have clearly been designed specifically to suit the headphone. They're not just some off-the-shelf, chuck it on here, that'll be good enough, because you wouldn't expect that at $5,000 US. As we then look deeper inside the cups, we start to see what does all the magic, and that's the driver itself. Once again, like the original Utopias, we've got a beryllium dynamic driver there, and once again, it's pressed into an M-shaped dome. And what that means is that the dome is actually quite sharply contoured, and that's going to add rigidity, which means the dome is going to move in a pistonic nature. You're not going to get the cone sort of wobbling and breaking up through its excursion, and that's going to mean less distortion and a more linear movement to produce more pure, more transparent sound. What Focal have also done is they've applied that same M shape to the actual grille that covers the driver, and according to Focal, that improves the airflow through the actual grille, and it makes for more linear delivery of the airflow, and therefore again, a pure, more transparent sound. Whether or not that's true, I have no way of testing, but suffice to say, these do sound better in my opinion than the originals, and we'll get to that more in a minute. Just to finish off talking about the drivers, it's worth noting that these are an 80 ohm headphone, making them sort of a nice moderate impedance headphone. They're going to work well with high output impedance amps from, say, an OTL amp, for instance, but also work really nicely with any kind of portable devices too. So really any sort of amp you can throw at them, the 80 ohm load of the Utopias is going to work nicely. In addition to that, they've got sensitivity of 104 decibels per milliwatt, and that makes them very, very easy to drive. You're going to get these to dangerous listening levels from any device you like, and I'm not recommending you use dangerous listening levels. The point is, you don't need any specific sort of super powerful amplifier or source to drive them, but what you will want, of course, is a high quality source. These are a premium headphone with an extremely fast and revealing driver, that being because it's a beryllium driver, meaning that it's very lightweight, very responsive, and therefore very sensitive. And so your quality of your source is very important with these, but power, not so much. And so on paper, and in terms of their comfort and their feel on the head, everything stacks up beautifully for the Utopias. And as I've already alluded to, that continues when you listen to them. The moment you put on a pair of Utopia 2022s and listen to a favourite track, the first thing that's going to strike you is just how quick and transparent they are. These are like a perfectly clear lens into the music. They don't impose themselves in any way. They don't have a sort of tonal coloration or a slowness or an overly fastness to their sound. They've got just the right balance of articulation and speed, but also enough kind of decay length. And what I mean by that is that the notes have a sense of presence and weight to them. They don't sort of disappear too fast and leave you feeling like the music's disembodied or lacking presence. They've really struck a nice balance point here. And that leads to the overall tonal balance of these. I do feel like they've got a slight lean towards kind of clarity, a slight lean towards mid-range and treble compared to bass, but it's very, very slight, and the result is a very enjoyable and natural tonality overall. One of the things I really enjoyed about the original Utopias was their soundstage presentation, and the 2022 version just continues the same trend. And that's to say that they don't go particularly wide in their soundstage, they go a little bit beyond the ears, but not massively. But where they're fantastic is they go deep and they have a nice sphericality to them. And what I mean by that is that when you're listening to the Utopia 2022, everything sounds natural. Both the tonality that I've already said, but also the soundstage. Instruments come from where you'd expect them to within the soundstage if the recording has been produced and mastered well. Each sound has its own distinct place in space, and the separation of sounds is wonderful. So even though it's not a massive soundstage left to right, nothing ever feels congested unless it's in the recording that way. There's always separation, there's always space, and there's always layering and depth, and that makes the 2022 Utopia an excellent headphone in my opinion. Every time I plug these in, and this is across multiple different types of headphone amps and DACs, they're just always an immersive experience. Perhaps not in the foot tapping and head bobbing way that, say, a Meze Empyrean or a Meze Elite, depending on the pads, or a ZMF Caldera might be, but in an absolute just sort of immersion into the music, listening to all the details, but not being forced any particular details. That's where I think the Utopias really excel. Sounds like the articulation of a guitar string being plucked are also excellent, thanks to that very fast driver, that very responsive driver. I don't think they perhaps get quite to the level of something like a Hyphenman Susvara, which for me is still the very best I've ever heard at that, and I mean the articulation of, say, a plucked guitar string, but the Utopia 2022 comes very, very close, and to me is a slightly more enjoyable tonality overall. That's going to be very, very personal. I'm not saying they're better than the Susvara overall, but for me, I find the tonality of the 2022 Utopia ever so slightly better than the Susvara. Something else I enjoy about them is their sense of bass punch. They don't have a lot of bass to them. They're not a bass-shy headphone, but they're not also a bass-enhanced headphone. What they do really well within the bass space, though, is they've got a good sense of punch. You can feel the bass, you can feel that there's air moving, even though they're not particularly enhanced in any way down there. And I think a part of that is probably one area of, I would call it a weakness for the Utopia 2022, and that is their bass extension. They don't go quite as deep as I'd like them to, but having said that, very few flagship headphones do. And I say that to point out the fact that the Utopias aren't alone in that regard. I would have loved to hear if they could have produced this same performance with bass extension that was a bit more linear down low. But as it is, I don't feel like they're lacking bass. I'm just aware that if you're someone that wants sub-bass content, these probably aren't the best headphone for you. But I think across 90% of genres, the Focal Utopia's tuning is nothing short of wonderful. I wouldn't go to them for deep-reaching electronic music, but everything else, they're beautiful, they're natural, they're tonally balanced, they're wonderfully immersive. And that's probably a good summary of the Utopia 2022 for me. They've found a beautiful balance between clarity and engagement in the music. They've got that sense of transparency, accurateness, the lens into the music, without becoming clinical or sterile or having to do any sort of tricks to get your attention. They just present the music as the music seems to be recorded. Again, who knows what's right or wrong, but I don't get the sense that they ever get in the way of the music. As I said before, they're not quite a foot-tapping, head-bobbing headphone like, say, a ZMF Caldera, but they do everything else just so well. What that also means is that they're wonderful across any genre at all. They're probably not my first choice for rock and blues for that sort of head-bobbing, foot-tapping nature, but they're going to sound good on those genres, and indeed on any genre. Whether it's classical, chamber music, acoustic folk, rock, they're going to sound good. They're going to sound enjoyable, they're going to sound natural, and give you a really nice sense of what's going on in every recording you put them on, and every source chain too. I know I alluded to this before when talking about the impedance of these being 80 ohms, but it's something else worth noting. These sound great with solid state, they sound great with tubes, they work really, really well. And so the good thing for these is that you can tune these to your taste based on the amp you put them with, but they're not a headphone that you need to put with a certain amp to be able to enjoy them. And that for me is where I kind of like them a bit more than the Susvara in some ways. And this is not meant to be a Susvara knock or an anti-Susvara review. I love the Susvara, I respect the Susvara, but I didn't reach for it as often as I definitely reach for the Utopias. And the great thing is that on days that I want a smooth, slightly more relaxed listening experience, I might plug these into the shit Folkvanger or the Linear Tube Audio MZ3. And on days where I want a really clear lens into the music, I might plug them direct into the Hugo TT2, or I might plug them into the Enlium Amp 23R. Whatever it is, I can adjust what I'm experiencing based on the amp, whilst always using the exact same pair of headphones, and I really like that. And so at this point, you've probably got a good sense that I really like the Utopia 2022, but what we don't know yet is it one of the very best options, or is it just a really good option? And to work out that in more detail, I wanted to put these up against two other headphones. One of them is my previous daily driver in the Meze Elites, but I've also got coming up a comparison between the Focal Utopia 2022 and the electrostatic headphone, the Stax SR-007 Mk2. I'll explain why I chose to compare it with the Stax in a moment, other than the fact that I've finally got a pair here. But this makes for two, I think, very interesting comparison points. So let's dive in and start looking at the Meze Elites up against the Focal Utopia 2022. The Meze Elites have long been a favourite headphone of mine. Up until recently, they were my absolute daily driver headphone. And I say up until recently, what that really means is up until the arrival of the ZMF Caldera. And then since the Caldera arrived, it was kind of a 50-50 thing between the Elites and the Caldera. Then as the Utopia 2022 came into my life, that added a whole nother wrinkle. Initially, I was bouncing back and forth between the Caldera and the Utopias that actually managed to bump the Elites. But then, thanks to channel patron Neil for making the recommendation, I got my hands on a set of the new angled Alcantara pads for the Elites. Now I believe if you've bought your Elites in the last little bit of time, they'll have come with the angled Alcantara pads. But if not, I would absolutely recommend anyone that owns the Elites when they came with the old sort of flat profile Alcantara pads, reach out to your local retailer and get yourself a pair of the angled Alcantara pads. They are absolutely magic on the Elites. And so what that means is that since I got those pads in, things have been a lot more tricky to choose from. The Calderas, as I've already alluded to, are still my kind of head bopping and foot tapping headphone of choice. But if I want to really listen to a system, if I want to get lots of detail, resolution, and a really proper understanding of what's going on in the music and or the source chain, that's now become a 50-50 challenge between these two. And so let me talk you through now a direct comparison between the Meze Elites with the angled Alcantara pads and the Focal Utopia 2022. Both of these headphones run at about the same cost to start with, but I definitely recommend getting the silver-plated upgrade cable from Meze to run with the Elites. And so to make this more of a level playing field, I was using the Focal Utopia 2022 with a Forza AudioWorks hybrid cable. Running those two setups direct out of the Chord Hugo TT2, and I'll explain why I was using the TT2 when we get to the Stax part of this. Listening to both of them from the TT2 and listening to Woman by Mumford & Sons, the Utopias sounded just magic on the opening guitar in this track. As I said earlier in my general description of the sound of these, they do things like acoustic guitar and guitar in general so beautifully well. They manage to balance the articulation of the plucks and the strums with a nice sense of resonance and tonal balance to the sound. And so it just sounded beautiful as I kicked off this track. As the vocal comes in, it's quite an intimate delivery, it's fairly close to me, but it's also well separated from everything else and doesn't feel congested in any way. Initially, when the bass comes into this track, the Utopias give you a good sense of the impact of the bass, but it doesn't have a lot of presence or weight behind it. As it turns out, that's largely a part of the track, and it's good that the Utopias aren't kind of adding anything there. But it does also highlight the one area that I sometimes want to touch more from the Utopias, and that's the weight behind the bass. Not so much the impact, I think they do impact really well, but the presence, the foundation, that sense of weight is occasionally lacking. Focusing now a bit more on the vocals, and the vocal quality from the Utopias is just gorgeous. There's plenty of texture in the vocal, but there's also richness and body and harmonics to the sound. It's got everything you need, particularly from a male vocal like this, where it needs to stretch deep enough to pick up things like the chest resonance, but also still have that sense of texture and clarity for the various mouth sounds, the intelligibility sounds, all of that's there and beautifully balanced by the Utopias. At about 1 minute 37 in this track, the bass comes in a different way, a piano joins the mix, and now what I'm hearing is the Utopias have that bit more presence. I still think they're just a tiny bit shy of what I really enjoy in a headphone, but it's hard to complain about what I was hearing at this point in this particular track. And so listening up to about the 2 minute mark on the Utopias, I just felt like I was getting a complete and wonderfully kind of balanced delivery of this track. Moving over then to the Elites, and I was really interested to hear if I was going to perceive things at all differently. The first thing I noticed was again that opening guitar, and it sounded just a little bit fuller from the Elites. There was a bit more richness down low within those guitar frequencies. Articulation was still good, but the end result was a slightly smoother, slightly richer overall sound. And then as things continued, I became aware that the Elite was giving me a bit more high frequency information, particularly from things like the percussion. The Elites were enhancing something up in the upper range of the treble that I didn't get from the Focal Utopia. When the vocal kicked in, it wasn't quite as close to me with the Elites, so there was maybe just a step or maybe a step and a half back away from me as the listener. Neither is better or worse, they're just different. And then as we continue on, that bass sound that I talked about, not having sort of the presence and the weight behind it from the Utopias, that sounded pretty similar from the Elites. So even though they had a bit more emphasis and weight in the guitar, that didn't carry over to extra emphasis or weight within those bass notes. And that's largely about the recording, not so much about the headphones in this situation. Focusing back in on the vocals, and I'd describe the vocals as different between the two, but I wouldn't be able to say one was better or worse or right or wrong, they're just a little bit different. And specifically what I was hearing was that the Elites take away a little bit of the upper mid-range, moving up into the treble frequencies. They do scoop things out a little bit, and that leaves a touch more richness, a touch more smoothness to the sound. But the good thing is in this case that both of them balance detail and smoothness very well, so as I said, it's different rather than one being better or worse. From an objective point of view, looking at the measurements, the Utopia is probably the more true to the source sound. It doesn't suck away as much in the upper mids, but both are still very subjectively enjoyable, and that's all I really care about. Unless it starts to sound unnatural, I don't really mind if there's a cutaway, so long as it balances nicely with everything around it, and the Elites do that. When we get to that 1:37 mark, where the piano comes in and the bass shifts a little bit, it was really interesting to me that the Elites actually had less sense of impact on the bass. I wasn't feeling it as much from the Elites as I was from the Utopias. The Utopias gave me just that little bit more sort of tactile punch and weight behind it, whereas with the Elites the bass was there, but it was a bit less impactful, a little bit less noticeable, each individual hit of the bass. Again, neither is right or wrong, neither is good or bad, they're just different. The Elites come across a bit smoother, the Utopias come across perhaps a little bit more dynamic. I don't mean dynamic in terms of dynamic driver, I mean dynamic in terms of energetic. It's a small shift, it's not a big deal, but it was something I noticed. And so ultimately, as I got towards the end of this listening session, and I tried a few other tracks as well, these are two headphones that I can't split. I honestly think you could pick up either of them and you're going to be completely happy. Unless you want a really distinct tuning, of course, but if you like the tuning of one, I think you're going to like the tuning of both. Again, this is specifically with the angled Alcantara pads, and that's worth keeping in mind. If you buy yourself the Elites, you end up with two different sorts of headphones, because the hybrid pads do give you quite a bit more sense of bass. They're a richer, warmer sounding headphone with those hybrid pads. And so for me, both of these headphones are excellent. I don't think you can go wrong with either of them. I think the Elites are a little bit more comfortable for long listening sessions, although both are still excellent. And I think it really is going to come down to the track, the source chain, and potentially even your mood as to which one you prefer at any given moment. Both are amazing, both are wonderful, and it's kind of cool to have two outstanding sounding headphones available to us at the same time. If you're going to force me to choose just one of them, I actually don't know which I'd choose. I think it might come back to the Meze Elite purely because I can swap the pads on it. But having said that, it's actually been the Utopia that I've been reaching for more often lately. So that probably tells you something as well. Both are amazing, both are brilliant, really can't go wrong with either. But then that led me to another question. If you're going to start looking at spending $5,000 on a pair of headphones, what else should you consider? I've previously reviewed the LCD5s, the ZMF Calderas, which aren't quite that high in price. I've reviewed the Abyss 1266. Lots of these headphones up at around that price, they're all fantastic in their own way. I don't think there's a flagship headphone that I don't like. They all have something going for them. Now, of course, there's also some that I haven't tried yet, like the Final Audio D8000 or D8000 Pro. Hopefully I'll get to those one day. But of all those that I've tried, none of them have really let me down. Some of them have their quirks like the Abyss 1266, but they're all excellent in their own way. But where that led me to was the one area that I haven't covered properly yet is electrostatics. And because I've been fortunate enough to get my hands on a pair of SR-007 Mk2 from Stax, as well as the SRM500T driver unit or energizer unit, I thought if you're going to spend $5,000 on a pair of headphones, then what if you were to put that same sort of budget, or actually a little bit less, into a setup of a set of electrostatics? And so what we're looking at now is if you were to spend about $3,700 on an energizer and a pair of these SR-007 Mk2 electrostatic headphones, for way less money than the Focal Utopia 2022, are you going to get as good sound? Now, if you're not familiar with electrostats, they have to have their own energizer unit. They run on a very high voltage for the kind of bias, as it's called, of the driver membrane. And that's because they work a bit differently. I'll explain that when I get into the actual review of these, so make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell if you want to understand more and hear my impressions of these. But suffice to say, you can't just plug these into your standard headphone amp like you could with the Elites or the Utopias. And so you do have to factor into your budget buying the energizer to go along with the headphones themselves. And that does add a bit of a wrinkle because the energizer is going to influence the sound. But pairing up the SR-007 Mk2 with one of the better energizers in the range from Stax, I was keen to hear how these would compare with the Utopias. And a big part of my interest there was that the beryllium drivers within the Utopia 2022, and indeed the originals as well, within those headphones, those beryllium drivers are so fast and so responsive that they're starting to sound a little bit like some electrostatic can sound. Not the same, but we're getting that sense of resolution and transparency that normally electrostats are the only things that can deliver. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying they're the same, I'm saying they're heading in the same direction. And so I was kind of keen to hear just how close the Utopias were getting to that kind of electrostatic speed, because generally nothing gets close to electrostats in terms of speed and resolution, so I wanted to see what the golf was actually like. One of the drawbacks with electrostatics is often their bass, and so one of the tracks that I chose to listen to specifically for this comparison was Pressure by Muse. And that's because this has got quite a big, chunky sound, and I wanted to see how these two compared on a track like that. Starting off with the Utopias, and there's a wonderful sense of separation in the vocals in this track. The punch from the drum is really tactile, and there's lots and lots of texture and detail coming at me from the Utopias, but it's very listenable. Nothing was too much from the Utopias. The tambourine when it comes in was sparkly and crisp, but not dominant. It was very obvious, but not dominant, I'd say. And the overall control of the sound from the Utopias is nothing short of excellent. It's like everything is under control, everything is well kind of managed within the mix, whether it's bass, whether it's treble, no matter how busy it gets, the Utopias just take it in their stride. And that's one of the things I love about them, it's why they're so transparent into the music, because nothing throws them off balance. Moving over then to the 007 Mk2 Stax, and immediately the first thing that stood out to me was how much drier the vocals sounded. The tonality from the SR-007 is quite different from what I was hearing from the Utopias, through that mid-range band at least. I was very impressed to hear that the 007s were keeping up in terms of bass impact, so I could feel the bass in the same way from the 007s. That was impressive. But their speed of decay, the speed at which the notes stop and start, that meant that the sound was a bit lighter weight. I spoke before when I was talking about the Utopias versus the Elites, that in the track I used there, I felt like the Utopias needed a bit more presence in the sound. And that's true here again. Not for the Utopias this time though, but for the Stax. I felt like the Stax just lacked a little bit of presence, a little bit of weight in the bass for a track like this one. And so whilst the impact was there, I wanted more body beneath it. Something else that really stood out to me and kind of surprised me was that some of the top end sort of treble detail and treble emphasis was less from the SR-007 Mk2. Now this is more about tuning than it is about performance of the driver. Things like that tambourine sound that I noticed and mentioned from the Utopias, it was more recessed when it came to the 007. And that does kind of show that there is a little bit of emphasis in the treble from the Utopias, but it also goes to show the fact that it was enjoyable and not distracting, that it's very well controlled and very refined from the Utopias. That doesn't mean that one is better or worse than the other, they're just slightly different tunings here. And I like the fact that the SR-007 doesn't need to be bright because it's so fast and so detailed. It is actually allowing for a slightly smoother, slightly more natural treble tuning perhaps. Subjectively though, both are good, they're just different. And so after listening to Pressure by Muse, I was left kind of feeling like there were pros and cons in both directions. I didn't feel like I had a clear sense of one being better or worse than the other, and so I listened to a bunch more tracks. And over time, I've made a few notes, I've tried to get a sense of what I like and don't like about each of these, or maybe not like and don't like, but where the pros and cons are for each of these. And so the key things that separate these two is that the level of weight in the notes is definitely better for the Utopias in my opinion. I don't like the fact that the SR-007 kind of disappears too fast, the notes disappear too fast, and you lose that sense of weight and presence in the music. That's a whole part of their charm on the other hand because they're so fast and so resolving, but it means that listening to them isn't the same as if you're sitting in the room with the musicians. You lose any sense of reverberation unless it happens to be a really good live recording that's captured all that and it allows the driver to reproduce that. I think some of this comes back to the fact that the recordings aren't made with Stax in mind or electrostats in mind in general. Most mixing and mastering is probably being done on dynamic driver speakers, and therefore it does tend to sound a bit more natural coming from something like the Utopias. On the other hand, if we start thinking about tonal balance, I find that slightly drier upper mid-range is a bit less relaxing from the SR-007 Mk2, but on the flip side, their slightly more linear treble without some of the slight treble emphasis that the Utopia has means that the treble's a bit more relaxing from the 007s, so there's a bit of a trade-off there as well. I feel like the staging is a bit wider from the 007s, perhaps not quite as deep, but it's probably fairly well awash between the two as in terms of both doing excellent soundstage and imaging. But I think the overall thing that stands out to me, there's probably three overall things that stand out to me here. One of them is that the sense of weight and presence in the sound is easily better for me from the Utopias. I've already covered that one off. But on the other hand, and this really surprised me, the sense of bass extension was actually better from the 007s. As I listened to more and more tracks, the deep bass impact, the sense of the depth of the bass and the punch of the bass, I was finding better from the electrostats, and that really shocked me. Not because I expected the Utopias to be particularly strong there, I already knew they weren't, but because I didn't expect the electrostats to be strong there, and they were. And so whilst the weight of the sound is better from the Utopias, the extension and the impact of sound does go to the electrostats. And so that really then brought me around to what the final decision-making point for me was as to whether or not I think it's worth spending $5,000 on the Utopias or $3,700 on the electrostatic setup that I've got here. And the answer for me was that as I spent more and more time with them, the thing that tipped me over the edge towards one headphone instead of the other was the end sense of refinement. The sense of just hearing everything sound controlled, sounding smooth but still detailed, everything just sounding right. And that took me towards the Utopia. There's a little bit of harshness to some of the tonalities from the SR-007s that I didn't get when listening from the Utopias. That doesn't mean the 007s are bad by any stretch. They're wonderful, and I can't wait to spend more time with them and share a review with you. But it proved to me that the Utopia 2022 is the real deal. For me, these are one of my top 2 favourite headphones on the planet. I should say top 3. They're top 2 in the sense that it's the Meze Elites and the Utopias for that detailed, resolving, sound staging, all that sort of technicality type listening while still being enjoyable. And then the ZMF Calderas kind of sit off in a different category for me, for pure fun and full engagement. And so to bring this to a close, if you're in the market for a flagship headphone, you should absolutely check out the Utopias. They're wonderfully versatile across genres, they're wonderfully versatile across source chains, different amplifier types, you can tweak them and tune them based on the source chain you put them on. The build quality is exceptional, the sound quality is exceptional, there's really nothing missing from the Focal Utopia 2022. They just do everything right in my opinion. Comfort, looks, feel, sound quality, tonal balance, you name it. So if you're in the market for a flagship, make sure you check out the Utopias. They are a lot of money, but I do think they're worth the money. And so as always, I hope this video has been useful and helpful to you in working out if this is something that you should be checking out. And if you have found it useful and helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.